Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this recording of a session about caring for someone who drinks or uses drugs. My name is Matt. I help run the Drink Drug Hub website and deliver the training there. And if you enjoy the session, we'd love you to check out the website and the other training on offer. Now, this session we put on for Carers Week in 2026. And we've run it through summer, and as it's coming to an end, we've done a couple of sessions we thought would make a video, put it on YouTube for anyone who couldn't come to the sessions when we were running them live. So hopefully this is more accessible for those people who are busy, couldn't make it to a session, but still would like to see the content. So we'll make a start, and we won't worry about that side there. We'll come straight to the learning objectives. So we're going to look at the realities of caring for someone with an addiction. And then we're going to look at how we tell the difference between use and addiction. This isn't always easy to tell. Someone might be using drugs and it might not be addiction. It might not be something that we need to really panic about, but it's good to understand what the significance is of someone's use and when it falls into addiction. Then we'll look at common pitfalls that affect both carers and people who drink and use drugs. And then we'll take you through 8 tips to help carers for people who are caring for people who drink and use drugs, and then we'll look at where you can seek support within North Yorkshire. So we'll make a start here. The first bit is the difference between use and addiction, and one of the big things to point out is that this can make friends and family feel very uncertain and confused about when they should be worried and how worried they should be about someone else's use. That uncertainty can feel quite isolating. You can feel quite lonely. So one of the important things to talk about is knowing how to raise this as a topic and how to speak to someone. And we'll go through that as we go through this session today. Now, in terms of alcohol use, this is what alcohol use looks like in terms of dependency. So of everyone who drinks, about 1 to 1.5 in 10 people who drink become dependent on the substance. So the mere fact that someone is drinking is generally not a sign for us to be hugely concerned. Most people who drink do not become dependent to that. However, it can be hard to identify when it becomes problematic because alcohol use has been so heavily normalised within our society. So it's not that unusual for people to be drinking. So I say this isn't something, and it's not unusual for people to drink quite high amounts, potentially at stag nights, weekends, festivals, university freshers week, Christmas time, whatever it might be. We have normalised heavy alcohol use as well. So it can be quite difficult to know when should I worry about that. However, if someone's drinking alone, if they're drinking daily, if they're always arranging social activities around drinking, these are signs that maybe this is becoming more problematic. For under 18s in particular, any significant regular drinking should be something to be concerned about because that is relatively unusual at that age, and particularly if it dominates how they socialize with all of their friends, then again this may be something to think about in terms of whether this might be the prelude to more significant problems. For over 18s, there's actually a really useful tool you can check at the bottom there. We'll put the links in the descriptions for this video where you can check someone's drinking. So you click on that and it gives you some really quick, easy questions to answer about your own or someone else's drinking. And it will give you a score about how significant that is in terms of a problem. So there are tools we can use to check a person's drinking there. Like I say, that's really for people to do self-assessments, but you might be able to sit down with someone and do that with them. Now, in terms of drugs, again, maybe quite surprisingly for a lot of people, drug dependency rates aren't actually that much higher. In fact, they're not that different to alcohol. About 1 in 10 people use drugs become addicted. So again, the mere fact someone is using drugs doesn't necessarily mean this is highly problematic in terms of addiction, in terms of dependency, although it will always be problematic in terms of it's an illegal substance, so there could be the risk of being criminalised, and it can be an unknown product, so we don't exactly know what it is they're taking or what the risks are attached to that, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to run away with them and they're going to get addicted and dependent. And that's particularly true of 16 to 24-year-olds. So if you have a young person in your life who's using drugs, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be addicted and dependent. We have to really panic about it in that respect. However, it's really useful if they are willing to talk about it so we can understand what they're using and give them advice about staying safe. Often it's just about staying safe and making sure you're going to be healthy and well if you're using drugs, and some tips and advice about how to avoid addiction and dependency. So it's important to try and get them to feel comfortable to talk about it, and that's why confrontation, pinning people down and accusing them or coming across as quite threatening to them can be detrimental. In fact, it frequently is, and would generally lead to denial. So we would suggest try and explore more carefully their use with them. Suggest, ask them if they're worried about their use, and if they're not worried about their use, you could reflect back that maybe you are, and you'd like to discuss why you have these different viewpoints, and try and explore that in a collaborative way with them. Try and explore how much they're using, how often they take, and advice about how to stay safe. And like there's some good websites that you can go to get some quick advice. Say, please do read about what you're using and do follow the steps to try and stay safe. And we've got a couple listed there in this slide there: drinkdrughub, Frank, DrugBot, which we'll talk about in a second, and the Daniel Spargo Mabs Foundation, in particular ones we would direct people to. And again, we'll put the links in the description. And that can help us understand, make sure they're staying safe when they're using. So even if we are concerned though, and we do think actually there is a worry here, it's important to point out that they may not share those concerns, and that's because they might not be ready to acknowledge this or change, and we're going to look at that in this session as well. In the meantime, it can be really confusing, particularly on drugs, if you have no experience yourself about using drugs, or your drug use was many years ago yourself. It can be hard to understand exactly what people are using and what the significance of that is. And for that, we would actually point you to one tool in particular developed by Cranston. The link is there, and again, we'll put it in the description under this. It's called DrugBot. It's a really easy tool to use. You can ask it any question and it will give you reliable answers around drugs. And I think this is a real game changer for family members and friends who are trying to help someone on drugs but don't feel like they understand the topic well enough, and certainly don't know how do I give advice about staying safe or signpost people to that advice. So to give you a bit of a demonstration here, just with some screenshots, it will ask you, how can I help you? And you can ask it any question. And in this case, we're suggesting someone saying, well, my son's using ecstasy, should I be worried? It will then think about it for a second, and this is the response that we got when we put that question into it. And it will give you some really valid information about it. Like it's saying, it's understandable to feel worried. And then it gives some context around why people use ecstasy. And then it gives you a couple of pointers about what matters most when people are using it and the key things to look out for. So there you go on the left there, you can see some real key steps about this is the sort of stuff that we should be making sure anyone using ecstasy knows. So it's really useful to make sure your son knows this stuff. Then it will ask some other questions for you to answer, as you can see on the right, to clarify further other advice or support that might be useful. And this way it can guide you to the right information and the right support. And it's really easy and accessible, and it can really help demystify things and manage that confusion and isolation that family members can feel when they're faced with this situation. So we definitely recommend to check out the DrugBot tool. Like I say, have a look in the link in the description below this video. In the meantime, if a loved one is drinking or using drugs in a way that is causing them harm, and you're confident this is a problem, then the question is like, what can you do to help? And that's the recurring question facing carers. Now, for many carers of other health conditions, this can be more straightforward, and I'm not trying to minimize how difficult that can be and how fatiguing it can be and how challenging it can be. But I think when someone has other health conditions, it's very clear that they can benefit from practical support or personal care or financial support or emotional support or help to access other services. There's a bit of a playbook that you can follow to deliver that support, even though it is incredibly tiring and exhausting and potentially overwhelming. But you have a clear outcome you're trying to get to with it. However, and I'm not saying that's for all conditions, by the way, I'm just saying generic care, I think there is that kind of overarching clarity of your role as a carer that maybe we don't always have when we're trying to support someone around addiction. Around addiction, it's not as straightforward as we provide practical support and that resolves that particular problem. Often you'll find, I don't really know what to do. I can provide practical support, I can provide emotional support, I can help them financially, and yet this addiction continues to roll on, and I really don't know how to fix this. And this can feel really overwhelming, and I think this is one of the things we're going to flag out right away in this session and say it's a real common pitfall that carers fall into, which is, what do they mean by fixing this problem, and what is the goal they're trying to navigate to? So that's the first one we're going to look at in these common pitfalls, which is the goal that we're aiming to as family members and carers. And often the thing that we're trying to achieve is to stop the addiction, resolve the drink and drug use. And that's the outcome that we're motivated by. And it makes sense because when we think back to their life before they had this problem, often we'll think they were okay. Now there is this problem. We need to fix that for them to be okay again. So I totally understand why carers feel like this. However, there's a flip side to this, that it puts the carer in a real position of powerlessness. They cannot actually create this outcome independently by changing what they do and don't do. And what we'll see through the session is that carers will try different techniques to try and make sure this happens. And often these fail and cause a lot of frustration and pain and conflict. So one of the things we have to do is kind of shift the focus and accepting actually a person, if they're not in that position to make those changes themselves, we can't force that issue through. We have to change the aim to a degree to something that is more achievable and also puts the carer in a position where they can have some say in things and they can feel like they do have some power and authority, which is in itself quite reassuring. So in this case, we would say swap your focus from saying the addiction has to be cured for things to get better to saying, actually, let's think about how we manage the relationship, how we manage the household, how we manage everything around the person while that problem persists. And in this way, a carer can feel empowered because we can talk about their needs as a carer. We can talk about needs of other members of the household. We can talk about how the household needs to operate while someone is using drugs or drink in a problematic way. And in that respect, a plan can be created that serves both people here and enables them to feel heard, to feel like they've got a voice, and to feel like there's some acknowledgement of them. Otherwise, an addiction can feel like it just takes over everyone's life. So one of the first things is to switch the focus away from necessarily fixing the addiction, although there's obviously one big thing that we will look at in this session, to how do we manage the relationship and how do we manage everything while an addiction persists. And often you'll find the better we do that, the more likely we can get to the outcome of the addiction resolving, because we've resolved some other stuff around it first. But like I say, we'll explore this as the session goes on. The other pitfalls, the first one is trying to change that focus from what the outcome is we're aiming for. The second pitfall to be mindful of is the stigma that surrounds addiction, drug use in particular, and problematic alcohol use. Stigma itself can act as a real barrier to change, and certainly a barrier to seeking help. And we've got some sort of guidance there that you can see on the screen. I won't go through it all, but there's basically three fundamental ways this enacts itself: institutionally, culturally, or individually. In other words, people can be judged for their alcohol or their drug use, and that means they can find it very hard to access support for themselves. There's a couple of impacts that this has on that person then. The first thing is it can really increase strain on family members and carers because they feel that they must negotiate for their family member to access support on their behalf. So they're often occupied a lot of the time trying to negotiate, how do I get them an appointment? How do I argue the case for them to make sure they can access help? How do I get them into services and stay in services to get that help? If they can't get that help, we often find then people fall back on their informal support much more heavily. So actually family members step forward and end up having to fulfill the roles that professionals should be fulfilling because the professionals aren't there. The other thing is families can also feel stigmatized by association, by having a family member struggling with addiction, so much so they can effectively, and I'm not a huge fan of the term, but collude is often how it's referred to. They can collude with the addiction to try and hide it. So in other words, if someone's missing work because they're hungover, the family member might ring up work to say they're not feeling well. This might be hidden from work, from employers, but also from other family members, extended family members. And that means the problem becomes very isolating and very difficult for the immediate family members to manage. And this is what happens. We get a lot of strain now happening on this relationship. And like I said, this relationship's critically important, as we'll explore throughout this session today. And that's why a lot of the focus needs to be on how do we sustain this relationship and how do we support these people as a unit, rather than saying we have to fix the addiction. This is why we have that different goal. So I say the person struggling with their drink and drug use, they might struggle to access formal support. They might rely heavily on their informal support, putting more strain on this relationship. And they may have this misplaced attempt to maintain that relationship by hiding their drink and drug use. In other words, they think my drink and drug use is a problem for the other person. So the way I'll resolve that is I'll hide it so that they don't know about it, and almost what they don't know about won't hurt them is kind of their underlying idea here. It almost always fails. It almost always backfires. Because first of all, this other person, their carer, their loved one, often feels unsure how to help. They don't know how to fix this. They feel overwhelmed. They can feel isolated because they can find it really hard to get professional support involved, as we've seen, because of stigma. And because they feel powerless in this situation, because they don't feel they can fix this problem, their way of trying to regain power again is often to try and manage the situation directly. They'll generally do this one of two ways, either by taking control or withdrawing support. We're going to look at that in some detail. They may even take on responsibility for managing the addiction. In other words, I'll take this on and try and fix it myself. And we'll look at how that goes in a second. But ultimately, what we end up with is a real strain in this relationship. And what we get then is a carer in this position here. And we tend to find, we've called this the carer continuum, that they will have two general responses to trying to manage this. In other words, I'm trying to manage the situation. I've got two ways I can go. The first way is I can give up. And that's on the left side of this diagram. And that's where they become withdrawn. They might limit contact with their loved one. They might withdraw all forms of support. They might refuse to engage with them around this issue. They even might start giving them the cold shoulder with the intention of making them wake up and basically affect change. The other way they might go with this is they become dictatorial, and that's where they start to take charge. That's because they think, well, someone has to do this, so I'll do it. And we can find things like them giving ultimatums, again, withholding support, withholding funds, withholding drink or drugs against the wishes of the other person. Or there may be even threats to inform others, like, I will now inform your employer, your boss, whoever it is, unless you change. So this either way of this diagram tends not to work, withdrawing completely or becoming dictatorial. If the outcome is to try and change the other person's drink or drug use, tends to fail. So we have to be really mindful about where we're at on this spectrum. What we also tend to see is as carers get more fatigued and worn out, they're more likely to go to these extremes, and also they can move from one to the other, flip one way or the next, and that can become more extreme and more regular depending on how fatigued they are. And one of the things we'll look at today is understanding how fatigued you are and what to do about it. One of those signs is that you're on this spectrum and you're moving one way to the next. So we'll look at how do we avoid that, and that's where we're going to go through the 8 tips around trying to support someone who drinks or uses drugs. Now, I won't go through them all here. That's a quick preview of them. We'll go through each at a time and summarize them at the end. So to start with step 1, this is about understanding and preserving or prioritizing your own needs. And this is again where we're going to say accessing support from a carer service is highly recommended to help with this step. You'll see this over and over again in the session today. Don't underestimate how useful it is to have a carer service involved in your life. So, for instance, if you have a look at Carers Resource, that's one of the ones we have in North Yorkshire. We've got 2, Carers Resource and Carers Plus. Carers Resource's website has resources on there for you to have a look through about things like how do I care for myself. This is really good advice here. First one on there is about talking with others. So this is about not hiding away, not isolating it. That's really hard due to the stigma that surrounds addiction and drink and drug use, feeling like I can't talk about it. That can increase feelings of shame, guilt, loneliness, isolation. Talking about it can be really helpful. But often it's not just talking about it with anyone, it's talking about it with people who understand and can empathize and can help. And that's why we would really flag up here the value of carer services like Carers Resource, but also the value of North Yorkshire Connected Spaces. Now, North Yorkshire Connected Spaces is based in Harrogate and Northallerton. They're a lived experienced recovery organisation run by people in recovery. As you can see there's Emma in the middle. She runs the group in Harrogate. Roland runs the group in Northallerton. It's the 2 bases they work from. In the background, we've got Stephen, one of the volunteers there. You can go along to one of their events and have a chat with them. They'll understand exactly what you're going through because they've been through the same thing. It's open to people in recovery. It's open for people who are searching for recovery, and it's open for family members as well and loved ones trying to support. So like I say, you can go there and there'll be for a non-judgmental, supportive responses from people about, okay, we've been there, we understand. And if even it's just talking about it, that can be helpful. I say we'd would recommend having a look at them to attend, and I'll put the link in the description as well. You'll see all the links below this video. Some other advice you'll find on that CARER'S resource leaflet there is about staying healthy. And again, this is often about lifestyle. It's often about things like eating well, sleeping well, exercising well, getting time out. One thing we should point out is that's often about having healthy routines. Routines can be hard to keep when you're caring for someone with an addiction, because in particular their life can be a bit chaotic. Some days they can be very withdrawn. They could be in withdrawal and struggling. Some days they could be quite intoxicated. That means like their meal times can be quite sporadic. Sometimes they might not have an appetite. And if you're trying to share meal times with them, that can be difficult. So sometimes it's about understanding you need to stick to the routines that are good for you and let them kind of engage with you around your healthy routines rather than you going over to their kind of more chaotic routines, if that's the kind of situation you're in. Also make time and space for yourself. That isn't just about getting time out and time away in the way that we think about it, because you might get time out and find that you're just ruminating and thinking incessantly about the problems that are going on for you, and you can finish it feeling it worse than you are. So sometimes this is about having a strategy about how to use that time out. Spare time alone can actually just give you time to ruminate. So it might be, I really need a distraction. So this is about being active when I've got time out, a hobby and interest. It might be meeting up with someone and asking them to make sure you don't talk about it, to say, I just don't want to talk about that in part of my life today. So you deliberately talk about other things. But it might also be that you do want to talk about it. You see, the first tip there is about talking is helpful. It's about knowing what's right for you in any given time and making sure others understand that, so you get the space and the time that you need to cope. The second point to make here is it's worth understanding their addiction. We often see conflicts, we often see fallouts and relationship strain because there's a failure to understand what's really happening from both parties, and there's a lot of conflicts and arguments. And actually, the conflict and argument is more painful often than the drug use or the drink use itself. Not to minimise that, but often it's the arguments and it's the kind of relationship strain that's so difficult to live with. So we've got an example here of how this misunderstanding can occur. And in this case, we've got Joel, a hypothetical gentleman who's left university. Now, Joel did start drinking as a teenager. He drank a lot at university. Now, after university, his friends have all got jobs, but he hasn't. And the case is he's just staying in the house every day, waits until about mid-afternoon, and then he starts drinking. Now, our explanation of this could be that he just drank too much and he became addicted. And this is a really common misunderstanding around addiction. The idea being that you get addicted because you drink or you use too many drugs, and that's how you get addicted. This isn't the case. And if you want to know that more, do come and have a look at some of the other sessions we run on drinkdrughub, because this is one of the big misunderstandings we have around addiction in general. And it's really important that we flag this up because of this misunderstanding, we blame people about their addictions because they decided to drink too much or they decided to use too many drugs. And this is where blame comes in. It's where stigma comes in. It's where a lot of hardships come in. And it's actually wrong. Now, to demonstrate why that's wrong, or it's wrong in part, I should say, there is some truth to you do need to drink and use drugs to get addicted, but there's a lot more to it. So we need to put the context around it. But to demonstrate why it's not the only explanation and why it doesn't satisfy the whole idea about addiction, we need to go back to Joel's university days and say Joel was actually one of a friendship group in which everyone was drinking heavily. He wasn't the only one who drank heavily at university. You know, it's quite common that people will drink like this in groups. So there he is with his friends. There's Harry, Lisa, Chrissy, Alan. Now, they have all left university now, and they have all actually settled down into stable careers as a chartered surveyor, school teacher, senior IT support. Lisa's a purchaser for industrial plastics. They're all doing really well. And yet they all drank like Joel at university. And the question is this: why didn't they all develop addictions? We know that really heavy drink use for many people doesn't actually lead to an addiction. And we can tell that as well because every Christmas time, lots of people drink really heavily. We see this across the UK. We see it in the advertising. We see it in the pubs. We see it in restaurants. We see it anywhere there's social gatherings, office Christmas parties. Quite often there's heavy alcohol use. And yet we don't see a big increase in referrals into treatment services every January afterwards because everyone got addicted. They don't. You'll know this yourself from your own life or from lives of other people around you in offices and workplaces where you work, perhaps. People do drink heavily, but they don't get addicted. They just drink less after Christmas. Lots of people do dry January and don't drink at all. The other thing we've got is that lots of people go on holiday, on all-inclusive holidays where they can drink more heavily, or even just general holidays where they take a lot of alcohol with them. So they will kind of let themselves go a bit on holiday. They will drink much higher levels. They'll drink every day. They don't come back addicted. They just come back and return to normal life. So this is the kind of evidence that undermines the idea that addiction is just about drinking more heavily or using drugs more heavily. So that's the first thing to flag up. It's not necessarily just someone made poor choices around their drink and drug use. Quite frequently, they've just made the same choices everyone else does. But whereas everyone else finds they can stop drinking or reduce it afterwards, or stop or reduce their drug use, a minority of people find that's not possible for them, and they find they're trapped in this cycle of use. So it's not that they're doing anything differently to begin with, it's just the outcome is different for them. So that's really important to bear in mind. It's important to bear in mind that the reasons for this are actually about things like their genetics, things like their upbringing, things like trauma that they've experienced, their current mental health, a lack of purpose, for instance. It's lots of other things that cause addiction alongside the drug or alcohol use. And those things often are things they don't control. Now, the other thing we need to bear in mind is addiction, once you are addicted, is about losing control over your choices. So we have to be really mindful that it can be very hard for people to change their drug use or drink use. That's why we call it addiction. So when they struggle to do this, we really shouldn't be judging them about it. We should be understanding this is the problem, that they can't change it because of negative consequences. So again, it's about trying to get the blame away from them, to say we shouldn't blame people for continuing a behavior that's damaging for them, because that's what an addiction is. We should try and seek to understand, why is this a problem for them and how do we help them? And in doing that, we need to realize that people can recover. Now, they're going to do that in their own time, and everyone's journey is different. It's not as simple as telling people they can recover and expecting them to do so. However, it is important to know that people do recover, and it's important to understand how that happens for us to understand what to expect next. And that's our third point here. Understanding how change happens. Again, carers and family members, this is a big problem. It's also a big problem for professionals who think that they can effect change. They can do something that makes the change happen. And actually, as you'll see, this isn't necessarily the case. We can do things that make change more likely, but we can't guarantee the change will happen. And we also need to be mindful about what change looks like, because often we think it looks like this. This is a story that's perpetuated throughout the media, throughout our understanding about addiction. The idea being that you can make a decision and stop, and then everything gets better. And this is actually, the headline there is from a news story, which I think really flags this up. It's really quite common, and you'll see this on social media a lot, that we'll have images of people when they were addicted and when they were in recovery, and they'll put these images side by side, and they'll tell the story of how awful it was when I was addicted, how much better it is once I'm in recovery. Now, in this news story, there were lots of images of people showing that this is me when I was addicted, this is me now. I haven't used those images because I'm not sure we'd have permission to use their images to repeat them here, so we've just put stock images over them, but they all conform to the model you can see here, the before and after shots. This tells us that basically change happens overnight, and that change is really positive and everything's a lot better when you've stopped. And this isn't really the case for many people. The other thing that I flagged up, because we'll always flag it up, is the language here. So this headline is talking about drug users, and it's talking about people getting clean. Again, we got to be mindful about this. Calling someone a drug user just defines them entirely by their drug use, and it kind of doesn't give them validity as a human being. We need to understand it's a person who is having problematic use with drugs, but they are first and foremost a person rather than a drug user. And the idea that people get clean sort of implies that when you're using drugs, you're dirty. And again, this isn't very helpful in terms of helping people view themselves in a more positive light. It's really quite stigmatizing. So again, we're flagging that up there because we'll always flag it up when we come across that language, and how we can try and use different language. So in other words, people in recovery may be a better way of terming that. But the main point to make here is how change happens. It isn't an instant, life-affirming, decision-based kind of process for most people. It can be for some, but for most people, change looks more like this. And this is a tool that we will use in therapy sessions to understand how change happens and to understand where someone is at a particular time. It's called Cycle of Change, and the reason for including it in a session is not to try and train carers into therapists and ask carers to take on the role of a therapist. It's important you don't try and become a therapist because it fundamentally changes the basis of your relationship. And to be honest, it's probably not going to work anyway, and it'll just undermine what you have, which is a relationship as a mother, father, son, daughter, or partner to someone. It's better to occupy that relationship than to try and become a therapist, even if it's very hard to get people into therapy. Maintain, the role as a carer instead. But even so, it is really good to have an understanding of some of the tools therapists use to help you understand what to expect. And one of the best ones, and one of the first ones that I'd say is worth familiarizing yourself with, is the cycle of change. Now you can see on the screen here, it was developed initially to model how people stopped smoking. So when the researchers looked at this, two in particular who developed this, they noticed that people didn't just decide to stop smoking and stopped. They went, actually, people go through distinct phases in their pattern of stopping. So to begin with, people in pre-contemplation, that's the top model circle that you can see on this screen. This means the person has no intention of changing their behavior. They're completely unaware there is a problem. That's the starting point. People may be in that phase for a very long time. They may never move out of that phase. But if they do, they're going to move to contemplation. And that is where people have an awareness of a problem, but they may have no commitment to action. So there may be just that sort of softening of the idea that maybe there's an issue here. They may then move back into pre-contemplation, go back into denial because that's a safe place where I feel safe. Or they may be able to stay in contemplation just with that awareness. The next step after that is preparation. That's where someone starts gathering information, maybe starts asking questions, maybe starts looking online. What would I need to do if I did want to change the problem? They're still not making a commitment to change, but they're assembling the information about what's actually involved in change if I think about doing it. And then they may commit to doing it. Again, they may not. They might move backwards. They might go back to denial again. It might seem overwhelming as an idea. But for some people, they'll move forward and say, no, I'm ready to do this now. That means I am committing to change. They'll follow a plan. They'll try and reduce their drink and drug use. They may try and stop. They may try and change other aspects of their life. It's really important, we're going to come to this, that plan is manageable for them. If that plan is overwhelming, if we try and change too much too quickly, they will often retreat backwards again and maybe all the way back into denial again because it just feels too uncomfortable to manage it. So that's why it's so important to have a realistic plan that's manageable for someone. If it is, and if they can manage it and if they can sustain it, then they'll get into maintenance. And that means I've got to my goal. That might be stopping drink and drug use. It might be using less. It might be using more safely. But ultimately, I've changed the behavior in a way that worked for me and I'm maintaining it. For some people, they may then experience a relapse. A relapse is where you fall back into your old pattern of behavior and you may even go back to pre-contemplation again. I'm unaware of this. I haven't really noticed this. This isn't really on my radar. Now, it's really important to try and communicate that to family members in particular, people who live with this in someone else's life, because if you can understand where a loved one is, you can understand what to expect next, and that can really help in coming up with strategies that work well. Now, the hardest places to be in this are the top three here. We all love people when they're in the action phase because then we can give them a plan and they'll follow the plan and we see change, and that's really reassuring and validating. And we're less confident about what to do when someone is in pre-contemplation, not aware there's a problem. They're just contemplating, but they're not committing to change, or even they've relapsed and they've kind of gone backwards again. What do we do about that? And in particular, what do carers do about that? Well, I would say that for carers, this is really difficult to do, but it's about the only thing you can do, which is to be willing to remain present in someone's life, regardless of where they're at. To understand that, yes, they may be in these places, but wherever they are, they're still a family member, they're still a loved one, that you still would like to be present in their life because that's the best way to support them. And that is very difficult to do because being present in someone's life then necessitates we're trying to fix things and we're trying to move them to another phase. And often what we're trying to do doesn't really help in that respect and causes conflict and arguments, as we'll see. So often it's just about, I can acknowledge that you're there. I can acknowledge that I don't know how to help other than just to be there for you. But at least we know what to expect, which is this isn't changing at the moment. but we can still try and manage this in the best way we can, and change may happen in time. It's really difficult to do, it's really painful to do, and that's why carers really benefit from getting their own support to help sustain them through that. Now, in this, we're going to move to the fourth point here, which is if you're in this position, you've got to try and avoid buying into the myths. And the myths are often telling you what you can do to get your loved one to another part of that diagram. How do I get them to wake up? How do I get them to change? How do I get them to stop? So for instance, this is what we flagged as the trouble with Google, because often people end up on Google here going, I want them to stop. Google, give me the answer. Like Google gives us the answers to everything. So we've put into Google here, my teenage son won't stop drinking, and very quickly it came with a list of different ideas and advice, links to other websites. And this is where we've got to be careful, because there are myths, there's misconceptions, and there's just downright bad advice on the internet. So for instance, this is something that we found on the internet, which is the idea that you're enabling a loved one's addiction. So it's an article on a website telling us about whether we're enabling a loved one's addiction. And it gives the example of a parent who has a child who is struggling with their own addictions. So the advice here from a professional, from a psychiatrist, I think, is that if you enable the child to remain at home and to remain financially supported, then ultimately you're enabling them to continue with their addiction. And it may be better for you basically to move them out of the home, withdraw your financial support so that they will hit rock bottom, and that might enable them to actually see that they need to get help. It's understandable why people might believe this or think that this is a good strategy, because basically it's about waking someone up to change. But actually what we know is this would be a really terrible piece of advice, in that we know that if we withdraw support, if someone is then without a home, without financial support, feeling like they've been abandoned, then actually the most likely thing is they will go further into their addiction, they'll go further into their drink and drug use as a way of coping, and actually recovery outcomes are much worse for people who have much worse lives to begin with. So actually, in this case, you're moving a child from maybe quite a difficult situation into one which is much worse. Now, it's not to say that family members might not be faced with having to make this decision for other means. So for instance, to protect siblings, or because the family unit can no longer cope with this, are, I would say, completely valid reasons as to why you may have to go, and explore solutions like this. But what we would not say is try and follow this advice in order to effect change, because probably the change that will be affected is actually worse rather than better. And this is about the concept of enabling, which we need to be really mindful of. This was highlighted in a book called Harm Reduction Approaches with Adolescents Who Use Substances. It's quite a recent book, came out last year. And in that, the authors really flag a couple of myths, two in particular. And they say this idea of needing to hit rock bottom is a bit of a myth, and we don't need to try and push people to hit a rock bottom in order to change. And the second myth is the idea that supporting someone enables them. Now, there's an idea as to, we know where these myths have come from. They come from the 12-step model. You can find them in like the Alcoholics Anonymous big book. And it says, there's a quote there at the bottom. If you have time to read it, you can always pause the video at this point to read it if you want. The idea being that basically people do need to hit rock bottom in order to change. We know this isn't true. Now, I don't want to undermine the 12-step model. I know it's really helpful for a lot of people. It's incredibly valid for a lot of people, but we do need to pull some things out of it and say these things are potentially quite toxic and harmful as ideas. So the first one, the idea of needing to hit rock bottom to change. We know that actually a lot of people don't have to hit rock bottom to change. I worked for quite a few years in a drug treatment service as an assessment worker, so I'd be the first person that someone would meet when they come in to get help. Some people would be in crisis, but lots of people aren't in crisis. They've just noticed something's not quite right with their drink and drug use, and they've decided to seek help. They didn't need a crisis to get there. And on the flip side of that, we have plenty of people who hit a crisis but don't change. They just hit another crisis after it, and then another crisis. They keep hitting that rock bottom. And very tragically for some people, this can be a really serious situation in which some people then ultimately lose their lives. So it's actually, you don't want to be in that position if you can avoid it. So certainly we wouldn't want to try and generate someone hitting rock bottom in order to change. It's not a good strategy, and it can badly backfire. So instead we would say don't try and follow that advice. The other idea is around enabling, and this can be really, really hard for family members because they can think, if I help my family member, does that not just enable them to continue drinking or using drugs? And I think we have to be really careful. There is a difference between enabling and helping. So generally, I would say if you are just providing support for someone around things like their housing, around food, around things they need to stay safe and well, it's probably better to provide it than not provide it, because not providing it does not necessarily mean they're going to stop drink and drug use. As many family members will attest to, they can withdraw the help, the person continues anyway. So actually it's better to try and reduce the harm that they're experiencing. You might draw the line there and say, well, we're not going to buy them drink and we're not going to buy them drugs. And I think that could be a very healthy place to draw the line. But even then, there needs to be that flexibility around it to go, what's the right thing for each family in whatever situation they're in. So for instance, you might have someone in your household who is a dependent drinker. That means they need alcohol in order to stay out of withdrawal. And if they go into withdrawal, that can be very dangerous for someone who is dependent on alcohol. It can, in very rare cases, prove fatal. So in that case, a family may agree to provide a set amount of alcohol every day for their family member in order to keep them safe. Not so much that they get intoxicated or inebriated, but enough in order to keep them safe. Now, technically speaking, you could call it enabling, but I think actually what you're doing is keeping someone safe. And hopefully that person will in time seek support to reduce and stop their alcohol use. But in the meantime, if they're not willing to do that, let's try and keep them safe. We can even have family members who may provide illegal drugs on the basis that this could be a safer supply than them going to a dealer. And again, we've worked with families who have decided for their teenager, instead of the teenager going to buy cannabis from the dealer, the family will provide that. And that way, they are the contact through the dealer, and the dealer isn't contacting the teenager directly and then offering other substances. That can be a good solution for some families. It can be a poor solution for other families. It is very much about understanding your own situation and what's best for you. But certainly, again, with that approach, you may well be reducing harm rather than anything else, particularly if your teenager then buys into other support that's available to them and enables them to move into the next stage of recovery. So I don't think we should have black and white rules for families. I think it's just about us finding out what works best. And if things don't work, change it and try something different. But certainly, let's not withdraw support from people who need support on the basis that we think that it's going to benefit them in some way. Often we find it doesn't benefit the person and it doesn't have the effect that we hope it will have. Now, the point 5 here is about maintaining healthy boundaries. How do we do that? And again, this is where accessing support from a carer service is really highly recommended, because they can be really helpful as an outsider to view your life and reflect back maybe rules and boundaries that might be helpful for you to sort of discuss in a safe space. And boundaries are really important because, as we said, people who are struggling with drink and drug use, people who particularly have addictions, will find their life is very up and down. Their life every day can be quite samey in terms of I get up and I try and use drink or drugs to cope with the day, and then I get, it can be quite repetitive. And yet at the same time, they can suffer a lot with withdrawal. They can suffer a lot if they can't get hold of the substances they want. They can get quite desperate some days. They can feel quite depressed other days. They can feel everything's okay other days. They can be really up and down and quite chaotic in terms of their outlook. This is not healthy as a carer if you kind of end up on that roller coaster with them. You need to try and stay grounded and stay in your own life as resilient as possible. And that can mean enforcing boundaries that keep some separation, not necessarily from you and your loved one, but certainly from you and their addiction or problematic drug use. And your boundaries may be things like saying you're not going to buy them drugs or alcohol, or having rules around that. You may have time where you're not available to them. So for instance, if you work, you might say, well, here are emergency contact numbers for you to use while I'm at work. I will not be available. You can phone and leave a voicemail, but I'm not picking up until lunchtime. And that means if they do have a crisis outside of that time, then there is the crisis service, there's other support available, or it's something you'll pick up at lunchtime or other agreed times. It can feel very harsh doing that, but it can ultimately give you the breathing space that you need. And it can enable you to continue to work and connect with other parts of your life that are really important. Boundaries can also mean agreeing responsibilities. So that just because someone is drinking or using drugs in a problematic way doesn't mean they cannot contribute or they are not able to participate in the household in other ways. That might mean agreeing rules around housework, contributing to rent, or even really simple things like tidying away empty drinks cans once they've been used. Agreeing rules around their drink and drug use is also really important if possible. That can be about times a day or places in the house where this occurs. A parent may agree for their teenager to smoke cannabis outside, for instance, rather than in the house. So again, there is acknowledgement that the teenager is going to be using cannabis, but at least there's a rule and a boundary around it that enables the teenager to remain part of the household while they're choosing to do this. You may have an agreement that they won't use cannabis incessantly within their bedroom and avoid their family completely, but they have to be there for meal times. Again, it's about finding boundaries and rules that will work, and it's about having something that fits, a wider plan to enable the household to work in harmony. The more consistent you can be, the better, but we do have to have a recognition that sometimes you may need to flex on a boundary just because that's how you're going to get through the next 24 hours because things are really tough. So the more you can stick to a boundary, the more consistent you are, the better it will be. But sometimes you may have to just sort of let things slide for the sake of being able to get through a really difficult patch. So we have to have that kind of acknowledgement there that that's sometimes what we have to do to get through tough situations. This is the 6th point now about having a realistic plan, which again reflects the fact that things can be very changeable and we need a plan that can be quite flexible to adapt to it. Often we find that an unrealistic plan is the source of a lot of conflict, anxiety, and upset. So it's really about finding a plan that does fit the situation. This is the kind of thing that can happen when you don't have a plan that really fits the situation. You can find as a carer, you almost live your life on the end of a yo-yo. So in other words, if your loved one is indicating that they're going to stop drinking, or they have stopped drinking, or they have stopped using drugs, you can find yourself feeling really elated and feeling that everything's going to be better, like they finally had this realization moment. And then they relapse, or then they do drink again, and you crash down again to the bottom, and you feel awful, like overwhelmed and frustrated and really angry about it and despairing. This can be exhausting because one moment you're up, the next moment you're down, and it's because we haven't got a plan that really fits the situation. And to have a better plan, I take you back to the cycle of change. If you can understand where your loved one is on the cycle of change, you can have a more realistic plan that enables you to stay steady, stay resilient, and keep your boundaries that keep the household working well and your life on track. And also is probably better for the person that you're caring for as well. An example of an unrealistic plan takes us back to Joel again. So Joel is the gentleman who's drinking after university and he's struggling to find a job. So in this situation, this is affecting his mum. And we've put here that his mum tries to discuss his drinking with Joel, but Joel just complains there's nothing else he can do. He doesn't see any problem with his drinking. Now that tells us that Joel's in pre-contemplation. He's not showing that he's got an awareness around the issue or any motivation to change. So it's really about listening to that, acknowledging that and understanding that, and then making a plan with that in mind. If we fail to do that, then we can come up with an unrealistic plan like this. And this is where Joel's mum basically tells him he has to seek help and he must stop. So she's moving towards that dictatorial stance. Joel's response to that is going to be that he either seeks help out of duress and engages superficially. So he'll go to a treatment service because basically he feels like he must do. But he's unlikely to really do anything with the plans that are given to him. He's unlikely to really follow anything. He's more likely to miss appointments, and this will backfire because it's going to cause frustration, arguments, and conflict at home. The other thing he might do is just outright refuse and say he's not going. And again, that can cause real conflict, arguments, distress, because then what does his mum do? Does she escalate things further? Does she threaten to withdraw things from him, kick him out the house? What happens then? That's because this plan doesn't fit the situation and it's likely to end in a lot more drama and pain and conflict. So we would say have a realistic plan, and a realistic plan acknowledges that he isn't ready to change. Now that isn't to say you can't express your own worries about his drinking. So Joel's mum does say she's worried about his drinking because it's important to feel heard as a family member. But at the same point, it's important to show that you're hearing the other person, so you can accept that he does not share the same view. So then it's about coming up with a plan that would work. And that could be about asking him to contribute to rent and bills, asking him to help with household chores, making sure he clears away his empty drinks cans, and trying to get an agreement with him that he doesn't drink during the day when his younger siblings are about. Certainly that he's not drinking maybe in the living room where his siblings are. That this is not something that they'll be exposed to in that way. Once that plan's been agreed, she can then put her energy into staying well herself, doing the things that keep her well and sustained, and making sure she's available to Joel for whenever he's ready to change. So this is about having that plan. Like I say, we can't make Joel change, but we can make a situation in which things are more amenable and in which change is hopefully more likely to happen, because Joel won't put all his energy into pushing back against his mum, and it maybe gives him the time and space to reflect on why there's this plan and why he's being asked to maybe not drink in the way that he is. It kind of means you don't get into that conflict, and it gives him the headspace to contemplate, and it may move him into contemplation in time. But even if he does, we need to adapt to every day. As we see in the cycle of change model, people can be in different phases. They can move backwards and forwards. A plan today may not be the right plan for tomorrow, and this is where we need to adapt. Recovery is not a linear process, so our expectations shouldn't look like that. Reality is it's a lot more messy. Like life itself is more messy. People move backwards, they move forwards, they relapse, they lapse, and it's really important to understand that this is normal. And again, that's why it can be really important to maybe reach out to connected spaces, speak to people who've been there, and they can reflect back. They'll listen, they'll reflect back. Yeah, no, that's happened to me. That's happened to other loved ones. This is what happens. And this is some advice about how to cope. So again, we'll take a case in point to explore this in detail. And in this case, we've got someone who's in the action phase of change, and that's Hannah. Now, Hannah has finally admitted she's using too much cannabis and that she needs help. So she goes to a GP, and the GP refers her to a recovery service. After an assessment, she attends a group, that's where she is here, and her partner is relieved because her partner feels that everything will be better now. Hannah's finally in a group, she's finally acknowledged the need to change. And that's where we have this myth about how change happens. Everything's going to be better. And fortunately, that myth is a myth, because after a few sessions, Hannah stops attending and says it didn't help. Her partner despairs, and that's the yo-yo effect. Suddenly she comes crashing down. This is her partner now. Her partner wants to know, why is Hannah not getting better? She feels overwhelmed. She feels frustrated. She knows it won't help. As often we know it won't help when we do this, but we can't help ourselves. She offloads onto Hannah. She tells her how angry she is, how disappointed she feels. And this is really normal to feel like this, and it's important to point that out. Carers may often feel let down in situations like this, and specifically let down by their loved one, because they can feel like, I've supported you, I've been there for you, I've helped you all this time, and you're repaying me by abandoning your treatment provider so quickly, and you haven't persevered to change. And this is where we get into this worst situation where there's arguments, there's conflict, there's threats, whatever it might be about relationships being over, and this can be a terrible position for both people. So actually, another way of looking at this is like this, that Hannah was in action. She did briefly identify that she wanted to change. And we should point out, it isn't uncommon that people may have a trigger that gets them there, and it can sometimes be a crisis. It's not always a crisis, like I said, but it might be a hospital admission. It might be an arrested for a drug driving offence. It could be anything that happens. A health scare, for instance, gets someone to think, I need to change. So they do something about it. But it's important to point out here that Hannah, when she did something about it, did go to a group, but her experience of the group didn't help sustain that change. The group didn't work for her, and it's important to recognise that that's not Hannah's fault. Of course, Hannah would have preferred it if the group had helped her and she'd felt better for going, but it didn't. And this is more reflection on the group rather than on Hannah. It's also important to point out that people can briefly feel that they're ready to change, but particularly if they have coexisting mental health issues, if they have other life pressures impinging on them, if they have huge debts to pay off or whatever it might be, they can quite quickly feel overwhelmed and they retreat back to denial as their safe space. So it's important to point out that change isn't just about stopping drugs, it's often about really understanding what are the other things that are happening here and how do we help people with all those things rather than just stopping drug use. If we don't, we will often find people move back out of action and into an earlier stage of change because the help wasn't there for them or they didn't feel that the change would happen for everything else that needs to change. The other important thing to point out is that stopping drink or drug use doesn't look like this at first. We have this image that I stop and everything's better, but actually you stop and often it's worse. You can experience really difficult withdrawal symptoms. You frequently have poor sleep or low mood. Basically, for a long time now, potentially, you've been using a substance to cope with everything and now it's taken away, but you still have to cope with everything. So how do you cope now? Some people will find they don't have the tools available for them to cope, and that is why they'll relapse back to their drink or drug use because that is how they will cope. It might take lots of attempts at this to be able to learn enough other strategies to cope to sustain a change. And again, it's about patience, it's about time, and it's also about trying to connect with people who've been there who can give you advice and make sure you don't feel like you're doing this alone. And again, that's why North Yorkshire Connected Spaces are so valuable. Now, while that's going on, a carer may not know how to respond. So a loved one might be quitting and then relapsing and quitting and then relapsing. And it can be very difficult to avoid that temptation of venting frustrations or confusion and saying, I don't get why you don't just continue to stay stopped. It's clearly the right thing to do. It's really helpful at this point to remember that this can be really quite normal and part of the process for many people. It doesn't mean they're not going to get there. And it isn't going to be a sustainable change in time. It just might take lots of attempts. In the meantime, it's again that key thing of what can you do? Sometimes all you can do is stay present in someone's life and go through that with them as difficult as it is. And again, that's why we would say get your own support and maintain those boundaries and do the things that you need to stay healthy and well to be able to do that for someone else. And that takes us to the final step, and that's recognizing that you yourself might not be coping. Like this strain is becoming overwhelming. And also, they might not be coping because the strain of having an addiction or problematic drink or drug use is quite profound as well. Now, signs that either of you are not coping, things like your routine's getting disrupted, so you're not sleeping, your diet's kind of gone to pot, you're struggling to get your exercise or time out, your mood's becoming more changeable, you're more short-tempered, you're more kind of fractures in your relationships, your outlook might be more bleak or pessimistic, and you might find you've got an increasing reliance on quick fixes, like lots of caffeine, sugar, fats, binge watching TV or doom scrolling on your phone, particularly when late at night when you should be trying to get to sleep, but there's lots of thoughts in your head and you're struggling with sleep, so you're just on your phone. This is where we can find people really start to struggle. Another key thing is your boundaries becoming less consistent and well reinforced. It takes effort to reinforce a boundary. If we find we're not enforcing them anymore, then actually maybe it's because we don't have the energy anymore to do that. And then we have anxiety spilling over into the areas of our life. Our work can be affected, other friendships can be affected, other relationships can be affected, and there's more disagreements. There's more conflict, and life is just a lot harder as a result. If you're not coping, again, general carer support is really important. Carers Resource, Carers Plus, we'll talk about them both in a second. Really useful to have a safe space where you can offload and you can vent to someone. And they're not going to maybe tell anyone else. It's just a chance for you to sort of express how you feel in a safe space. Better to do that there than to do it, offload directly on family members who maybe just aren't in a place to cope with that. The other thing is they can give you advice, they can give you support, they can help you set boundaries, they can reflect back to you, I don't think you're coping very well. Maybe we should look at how we're going to manage that. And if we get into that position, I think there's two main ways you can go with that in terms of whether you need some time out. Time out can mean literally getting some time out to yourself to help you reset, to reconnect with other parts of your life. But time out can also mean time together. And that's the bit sometimes we forget. Because time out, I think, is really important and I think it has its place, but it has a downside, which if we don't explain that to our loved one, it can feel like rejection, it can feel like abandonment. So I think it's important we do that. And it is important to do that and get your time out. But I do think it's important to get time together as well, which might sound like nonsensical because you think, well, I need a break, so why am I having more time with the person, who's struggling with the addiction? And the point we would make here is that you can have time away from their addiction and problematic drug use and time with them. And that's where you would agree with them. Let's have some time together doing something that's of quality for both of us, where we're not going to discuss drink and drug use. We're not going to discuss addiction. We're not going to discuss any of those things. That's not the focus. The focus is us being present in each other's lives as a mother and son, as a sister and brother, as partners, as husband and wife, whatever it will be. That's how we are present with each other at this time. And that's doing something that we will enjoy, a walk, a film, a meal, whatever it might be, in which the primary focus is in each other rather than fixating on drink and drug use that can dominate so much. Now, it's important to point out that when you do this, your time together should not include drink and drug use. However, a loved one may need to drink and use drugs beforehand in order for them to feel comfortable to do this, particularly if they are dependent. So it's about agreeing, maybe you need to have a drink and then we'll go and do this. Maybe you need to use some drugs to enable you to not be in withdrawal for us to do this. But it's important that they're not intoxicated. It's just about being well enough and present enough to be able to have time together. And that's why, as we come to the end of the session, we chose this photo for this session today. Now, these are stock photos that we use. You can take them from a stock image library. You put in the search engine, what do I want? And if you put in the search engine carer, you get all these images of people with arms around each other, often someone suffering and in pain and someone offering them comfort. And we thought we didn't want to use that image. We wanted to use this image here because we think this image actually reflects back the quality of having a relationship with someone, the enjoyment that you can have even while they drink or use drugs, or there's other things going on, that fundamentally it's still about being mums, dads, sisters, brothers, husbands, partners, wives, whatever it might be. That's predominantly how we hope people can identify themselves within their own lives and within the lives of each other, and that caring is an aspect of their life but not entirely their life, and they're not entirely defined by it. And we think that's really important. That's why we end with the message about making sure you have time together, making sure you still see each other in that sense, and not just as carer and cared for, or whatever terminology you want to use, and how important that is. Because once you're through the drink and drug use, things have recovered, that is still what you'll have. And that's the long-term quality of the relationship for a problem that hopefully is not lifelong, and certainly can be better managed long-term. And that can mean stopping, but it can mean other solutions as well. And that's the full 8 steps there that we've gone through. If you want to have a read of them, you can pause the slide at that point. And like I say, hopefully that is some guidance that will support anyone who's supporting someone who drinks or uses drugs. And as I've said through this session, it's really helpful to get support. In North Yorkshire, there's 2 services that you could go to. For Craven, Harrogate and Selby districts, we've got CARER'S resource. And again, we'll put the links in the description for this video. For Scarborough, Whitby, Rydale, Richmondshire and East Riding, you've got CARER'S Plus. Really great services. You can refer yourself online, give them a call, get some support. It can be for a brief time, it can be for a bit longer. It'll be for whatever you need to stay safe and well as a carer, to provide support, but for also to get your own support needs in place. And I say, you can go through drinkdrughub to find those websites, but we'll put the links in the chat in the description as well. If you have found this session useful, you can watch other videos on our YouTube channel that I'm sure you can scroll through now. We also have lots of live training sessions to attend. Most of them happen monthly. So if you go on drinkdrughub.co.uk, click on book training, and you can book another session there for a live session, or you can watch a recording on YouTube. If you've got other queries or thoughts from the session, you can contact us through the website. Click the contact tab. It will come up with a quick box for you to fill out, send your query, and we'll try and email you back as soon as we can, answering any queries or thoughts that you have. We hope you found the session useful, and thank you for watching.